I'm always grateful they put this on both sides in case I forget who I am. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome to this year's hot topic, Powering Our Future. Our social and environmental responsibility. I'm sure I don't need to remind you of the urgency of the climate crisis. Last year was the warmest year on record globally, probably exceeding, the 1.5% increase above pre-industrial level limit. So there goes the Paris Agreement, which, by the way, the Deputy Prime Minister, Winston Peters, has called an idealistic flight of futility. Echoed by ACT, so that's 2/3 of the coalition. Burning fossil fuels, releasing carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases is the major driver of climate change. For a terrifying vision, I recommend, have you read Kim Stanley Robinson's The Ministry for the Future? Shocking, eh? Remember that opening with the wet bulb event? Absolute. Anyway, let's not talk about that right now. Despite New Zealand Aotearoa congratulating itself on producing mostly renewable electricity, maybe 85% thanks to our rivers mainly, we are still very reliant on fossil fuels. 65% of our total energy requirement is from fossil fuels. Our major power companies are spending billions on the transition to renewable electricity, but will it be enough to achieve the target of net zero emissions by 2050 and enough power to keep the lights on? On our panel tonight, we have Dr. Wim de Koning. You got an umlaut on your O? Is it Koning?
I'm happy with that.
All right. Because it's king, right?
Absolutely.
Wim the King.
The king.
Ah.
And probably in the Middle Ages it was belonged to the king, but we forgot about that belonged. So,
All right.
yeah.
That's enough now.
Yeah, okay.
Creator of sustainable added value in agri-food industry, co-director of the Centre for Excellence in Transformative Agribusiness, which is, of course, one of New Zealand's major polluters, instrumental in developing the Lincoln University Energy Farm that Sam referred to. Dr. Claudia Schneider, lecturer in environmental psychology at University of Canterbury, leader of its environmental psychology research group, looking at what motivates pro-social behaviour. Pip Newland, head of risk insights and sustainability at Orion, New Zealand, the lines company for central Canterbury, and Nathan Surendran, who describes himself as a recovering professional engineer. He has expertise in built environment, energy systems, sustainability. He's an advocate for a shift towards degrowth. Aha. Well, as you can see, we've saved until last. Dr. de Koning, please introduce yourselves in 2 minutes.
Thank you very much, Kim. Kia ora, everybody. We need to think circular. We need to transform the way we create value. We need to start creating sustainable added value. 183 to 1. We have 183 landfill sites in New Zealand and only 1 industrial scale biodigester. 610. We, everyone here in this room, is producing 610 kilograms of municipal waste every year. Don't worry about it, because we'll cover it up in landfill. But the worrying bit is that what we actually put in landfill, part of that is glass, metal, untreated wood, and organics. And at the moment, we do not value that. 2.5 pentajoules is the energy value of all the organic, municipal organic waste that we produce as a nation. That is enough to power the city of Dunedin every single year. But again, we don't value that, because the majority is still going in, you already guessed it, landfill. If we are bold enough to look at this problem straight in the eye, if we are brave enough to realize that there is not a silver bullet, but we need to look at these things and accept multiple solutions, diverse solutions, at that moment in time, we have a chance, because we can become circular as a nation. And with that, like Kim already said, New Zealand electrifying, we will create enough opportunity for people to actually start thinking circular, create that renewable energy in their backyard. The Centre of Excellence for Transformative Agribusiness here in New Zealand is basically is playing its part in transforming the way we create value. Thank you.
Dr. Schneider.
Thank you, Kim. Kia ora koutou. Wonderful to be here and great to see the room so full with so many faces. I'm going to take the we do this kind of action sentiment from Ewan to sort of say that that is at the heart of action. It's us humans doing things or not doing things. So for myself as an environmental psychologist, what I'm trying to do is to understand what are some of the factors that shape our decision-making, our behavior, and apart from what are the factors that define our behavior, is there a way that we can encourage pro-social behavior, this idea that we do something for the good of not just ourselves, but others, future generations, people in other parts of the world that are more affected by the consequences of climate change, and so on. And my particular angles that I'm really interested in, do research in, is the role of emotions, how we feel and how certain communication makes us feel, and also the sort of communicator role when we think about, well, how do we communicate about these topics, about the scientific evidence base, and how does that have an effect on the recipients in terms of trust and decision-making. Thank you.
Thank you. At Newland.
Kia ora koutou. So thanks for having me along. For those of you who aren't familiar with Orion, so as you said, we're the lines company for Central Canterbury. So we take the power from Transpower and we deliver it to your door where we hand over to the retailer. So we don't generate the electricity and we don't sell it to you, but we do show up on your power bill to the tune of about 26%. So we're also community owned. And so that's by the City Council, Christchurch City Council via CCHL and also the Selwyn District Council. So what that means is that the assets that we design, build, own, maintain and operate are owned for our community and they have to deliver value to our community either through the energy that they deliver or through dividend. It's all going through a big transition at the moment. There's a massive, effectively the decarbonisation challenge is an energy challenge, and so that has a big impact on the assets that we design and build and own and operate. And our challenge is how to do that in a way that optimises the positive value that we create for our community, because the assets that we own and operate in the future will look very different to the assets that we own and operate now. And so how we can make that transition the most efficient possible to continue to support our community is really our key driver. And the way that we're proposing to do that is to put our customers and our community at the heart of that transition, because it has to be designing energy assets for our community to use for their benefit and resilience. So that's us.
Thank you. And Nathan Surendran.
Okay, I'm going to read an opening statement in contrast to the rest. Our current economic and energy systems are on an unsustainable path. Fossil fuels have entered a phase of exponential declines in the net energy available to society. By net energy, I mean the energy supplied to the rest of society, net of the energy required in the production of that energy. This reduction has resulted in accelerating declines in prosperity and ecological system integrity, alongside widening inequality, outcomes that energy-blind policymakers and commentators have missed because they do not use this lens. Whilst renewable energy offers a glimmer of hope, it's simply not enough to sustain our complex industrial society at its current scale. Energy efficiency gains are valuable, but subject to diminishing returns, and they can't outrun resource depletion. The decline in New Zealand's gas supply is just a preview of the global energy crises looming on the horizon. I'm picking that diesel supply, which, by the way, is not added to in any meaningful sense by the lighter oil produced in fracking operations, for example, in North America, may be the first truly impactful liquid fuel crisis of our time. We need a radical shift in our thinking. We must move away from childlike predictions of sci-fi energy futures, and also away from a faith-based reliance on the economic dogmas of growth and technology-driven improvements in productivity. Instead, let's move towards a target of degrowth and real-world sufficiency to meet the fundamental needs of our fellow citizens. Exports can follow if they're profitable. In my view, critical parts of this puzzle include embracing a push towards better societal energy literacy and adopting a systems thinking, problem-solving lens that recognizes layers within layers, our economy within and serving the well-being of a functional society, itself bounded by the energy and material resources needed to facilitate it, all of which can only happen within a functioning ecosystem. There are no jobs on a dead planet. The reality is that our future will be shaped by ecological and biophysical limits. A return to a less high-tech society is not a choice, but an inevitability. To navigate this transition as smoothly as possible, we must insist on a strong sustainability framing to our decision-making and the development of resilient, community-owned energy systems.
All right, let's just take a couple of points from each of you to begin with. Vim, you talk about 183 landfill sites and hardly any of it is being harnessed for energy. But how feasible is that? I mean, in terms of energy return for expenditure, what's the... things. We need a big. What should the government do? What should the government be doing at this time of existential crisis?
Oh, I was in the fortunate position to be invited to come to Parliament and to talk about renewable energy. And
At what point was this? After Shane Jones had said drill, baby, drill? Or after, or after Luxon had said gross,
no,
gross, gross?
This was still on the Labour. And but I was asked about the role of renewable energy and the role of in our rural landscape, because if you look at New Zealand, we are a rural society. Bar perhaps the Auckland region, we are still very much dependent on thriving rural communities. So how can we actually empower those? Or I know you don't like the word, but how can we help those rural communities? And energy is one of those helplines. One of the members of Parliament at that moment in time of the party that you already mentioned basically said, why aren't we being silly? Why don't we ask Australia to build another nuclear power plant and we just run out an extension cable? So it's
not such a stupid idea, right?
No, it's absolutely fantastic if you love nuclear energy.
Needs must. I mean, needs must.
Well, I think we need to do more place, like people already said, way more place-specific solutions rather than place-agnostic solutions.
Are they big enough, though, to save our quality of life?
100%.
Are they?
Yeah.
Pip?
I think so.
Do you?
Yeah, but you've got to be smart with the design. And it requires a long-term view and not a short-term. So effectively the return on investment of whatever you're building in that place needs to have long enough to come to fruition. It can't be like a 12-month turnaround. You've actually got to give it some time.
What do you make of Nathan's point that the density of energy produced by renewables is not sufficient to sustain our current level of affluence?
I absolutely agree with some of Nathan's points, particularly around the need for literacy and around the systems thinking aspect of things. So definitely agree with
you
that.
guys have made it so complicated, the energy system. Who understands the energy system?
Well, but I think what I'm interested in is how far efficiency is actually improving that equation over time and how quickly that's actually happening. So when you're looking at solar panels, which actually started out deeply inefficient, but becoming increasingly efficient over time and increasingly adaptable in terms of their use, in terms of like where people can put them. So that's just one aspect of it. That's even just missing the really basic kind of swap of liquid fuel and how inefficient that is. When you burn it in a car, you're creating miniature explosions. There's a whole lot of energy lost in that, and it's way more efficient to drive an electric car than it is to drive an internal combustion car. Right. So all of that, you don't have to have a like for like, but I'm also recognising that I'm straying down an engineering territory where I don't have 100% of the knowledge there. So, but I do think that role for efficiency and the role of technological improvements in efficiency will have a big impact in there.
People were talking about solar power, Claudia. I just wanted to run this past you because it's in the realm of psychology, right? We could all have had solar power 5 years ago, but it was inefficient then, and now it's much better. But when does it get peak efficiency? When is the right time to get it? And when you won't meet somebody saying, "Oh no, I've got a much better system now, you should have waited."
Not sure I can answer the question about peak efficiency of solar power.
I think it's important in terms of what people do. It's the same with EVs. At what point do you think, this is a really good mechanism, machine, system, and it deserves to be, as opposed to hanging out for a better one round the corner or a cheaper one.
I mean, what I can say from a psychology perspective is that I'm kind of like seeing this a little bit with the sort of hybrid cars and with sort of solar panels on private houses, is that what people around us do in our communities is hugely influential for our own behavior, so the kind of, social norms. And if you're like, the only person, years ago, a lot of my research was like based in the US driving a hybrid, and everybody sort of stares at you weirdly, puts barriers up. Versus if it's just a thing that people do. So there's also this argument of just somehow getting over that initial hump by getting a critical mass to then almost have this like movement character. We like know how powerful movements are, and there's research on the so-called, dynamic norms, kind of like things are changing. More and more people are eating less meat or are doing something very, very powerful. So I think if there's just sort of like, if the technology is there, and if it's obviously there are other barriers outside of psychology, like it has to be affordable, people need to have access to it, all of that. But then from a sort of behavioral psychology perspective, if we are a part of something bigger, if other people are doing it, and if the sort of positive outcomes are clear, if we have efficacy and we're not sort of being forced into it because we like autonomy as humans as well, then that is a quite good avenue towards change.
So from that point of view, the government should be offering incentives to buy the EVs, to put the solar, things that could have a cumulative effect beyond the subsidy that they're immediately offering.
Yes and no. However, with incentives, there's also a large body of research around sort of types of motivation. Incentives relate often to external motivation, which is very different from internal motivation. So if I do something out of my value base, out of my beliefs, my conviction, it's much more powerful to sustain that, keep doing it, make it a habit, be a proponent of it, compared to just doing something for, getting a rebate or something. So, it's like shown if in like studies around making like bus tickets really, really cheap for a short amount of time, unless that sort of relates to people's actually wanting to do it in terms of lifestyle changes and values, it goes away.
By nudging people onto the bus, they will find they like it?
Well, this is another sort of like a big point in research generally. Like very rarely do you get everyone, right? There are those who are very sort of on board with it, and they might just sort of, change on their own. There are those who are the hardcore deniers, and it's very hard to get them, right? So it's kind of like those people in the middle who could be maybe swayed. So yes, like once you start doing something, also because we know the power of habits. Once people actually do something, and they might, get a really, really cheap bus ticket, and they try it out for like 2 months, and if there are actually enough buses that they can commute in a good way, and it doesn't take like 2 hours or however long, right? But like if the sort of infrastructure is there, then you're right. Like that can also then instill habits and maybe actually a change of people's values and attitudes, because we also know that having that congruency between what we believe and what we do in psychology is very, very important, to not have dissonance there. So if we get people to do something and then they feel empowered, they have that added benefit of this is a good thing for the environment, for others. Others are doing it as well. It's affordable. It's possible.
Can you see that happening? Can you actually see that happening in this context?
You mean specifically to solar panels that people would have on their own houses, energy, or paying more for renewable energy?
EVs, electric bikes.
I mean, well, EVs, it's a whole other topic, because there are definitely barriers to actually getting an EV, and they're like socioeconomic barriers. So again, all of these outside of the realm of psychology play a role, right?
That would call for, you could call it incentives, you could also call it subsidies.
Yeah, like there's definitely sort of, when you look at the kind of behavioral science psychology research, right, like at the kind of models, it never sort of explains all the variants, right? It's a part of it. So I think the kind of, subsidies or certain restrictions or like certain regulations, they can create an environment where then things are possible, and then the sort of like behavioral science nudging part, psychology, can come in. So I think I want to be positive that yes, it's possible, but things need to come together. If nothing else changes, and it's just about, well, it's like nudge people with some big signs, like do something good for the environment, right? Like maybe that's not enough, right? It has to come together.
And maybe we've lost that level of social cohesion now. You need social cohesion for that kind of change to take place in a society, don't you?
it certainly doesn't help if there's a very sort of fragmented people in different camps. I mean, the US is kind of like the poster child of a lot of bad things when it comes to the environment. And again, sort of a lot of my research, where it was for a very, very long time, like very, very politicized, right? The kind of Republicans, Democrats, and sort of the research showing that just the power that the sort of affiliation with a group and that identity has, that if a statement is shown to people that comes from, and you disclose this comes from a Republican and the group sees it and sort of this comes from a Democrat, people react to that very differently and take the same information very, very differently.
Can you see that happening here?
I think because we know that people sort of form groups, and that is something that's very important and the kind of like in-group, out-group dynamic. So if there are any kind of groups and people sort of feel a belonging to that, and if that gets polarized enough, that can be definitely a barrier. So I think in terms of social cohesion, it's something that is very important, and ideally we want to foster that more, or at least try to depolarize the divide, because that is, just from what the research shows, a huge factor in being a big barrier to change in the environmental domain.
I mean, we had a government, the leader of which called Climate Change Our Nuclear-Free Moment, and they got ditched fairly unceremoniously, and we now have a government that says the Paris Agreement is a waste of time, and that we need to mine and drill and grow. Now, unless there's some kind of grassroots revolution, what can happen? Looking at you, Nathan.
Nathan is leading it.
No, but I mean, really.
What can happen? I can answer that question. Yeah. So I think a couple of things. One thing to recognise is that New Zealand's population in its entirety barely registers as a medium-sized city in the global scale of things, right? So in terms of our buying power to get a cost-effective solution for islanding-capable PV installations at the community level throughout rural New Zealand to support those communities and get them off the transmission lines which are becoming unaffordable to maintain, then, there's really simple things that can be done.
That face has gone really scrunchy now. You can have a right of reply. Yes.
Yeah, there are things that can be done there. And similarly, the project that Wim and Pip are involved in around the Community Energy Accelerator, in actually showing how communities can come together and do well collaborating around a renewable energy system is absolutely the right way to increase energy literacy in society by, as Wim says, demonstrating the value that's there. I think it should go further. I think, we've talked, Pip's talked about how the lines company is owned effectively by the community through the city council and so on. I think that actually there should be changes to the regulatory setup such that we can actually have community-owned renewable energy generators which recycle the money that people are paying to the generator back to them as dividends, and get away from this model where we outsource all that to larger companies that own the gentailers and the
What idiot thought that up?
Well, what's that?
What idiot thought that system up?
Which system?
The whole idea of shareholders and... Oh, sorry, that's capitalism. I forgot.
The reality is that there are alternatives within the capitalist system that can subvert it, I guess you would say, from a certain perspective, but that can make it work for the common man. And those are around collaboration at the community scale, they're around public ownership of assets, with a view to those being, things that we get a commercial return from, and we work collectively as a unit to leverage that value for then.
Of course, this will be anathema. I'm sure, Pip, you're on board with that because you're essentially a community organisation, right? Yeah. But the four big power companies, they're not in that business, are they?
No, and you know, the reality is that they have a model which works well for overseas shareholders.
Of
And the
course.
conversation that we need to have as New Zealanders is, are we happy with that? And if we aren't, and we would actually like to see some of that value recycled back into our communities, then we need to change the way that we vote, and we need to change the way that we empower people like our lines companies and so on to actually make an objective difference. And that requires energy literacy, it requires financial literacy. You know, there's some basic problems with the education system where, you know, kids get out of school without having that level of knowledge, because it's not complicated. You can make it very, it's not complex. You can make it very complicated, but it's actually really simple.
Here's the other thing, though. These 4 big power companies, the Mercury, Meridian, and Contact and Genesis, they are spending billions on the transition to renewable energy, wind and solar,
Yeah,
and
and
geothermal,
they're doing
right?
it at, you know, grid scale with multi-megawatt wind turbines at farms and solar farms.
Which is
with enormous battery.
ultimately getting us off the fossil fuel. You're suspicious?
I'm suspicious of it in a number of ways. I think, you know, ultimately they are doing things that make commercial sense, and they're optimizing for the highest return for their shareholders rather than the best outcome for the citizens of the country. Those are 2 different things, and they are literally two different groups of people. And they are also doing it at a very large scale, where I think the evidence, and particularly the stuff that I was talking about before about, you know, the end of the fossil fuel age and the end of industrial society, indicates that we should actually move to a more local scale when we're implementing these things. I think doing it at a large scale still requires large scale distribution and transmission of that energy around the place, and that will become uneconomic to maintain. Smaller scale systems, particularly if we did it as a nation and we bought a standardized system, you know, this is the engineer kicking in, that actually was something where we could hold a strategic reserve of spare parts sufficient to see us through, you know, several months where the Alpine fault has knocked out all the bridges in the South Island or something like that, you know, so that we can actually train technicians in our local communities and create jobs to maintain and operate those power plants. You know, there absolutely are solutions that are right there on the table. I could go and I could buy the components tomorrow and do this. You know, it's just it's political will, and it's a sense in the society of this is something we want to do, and currently we don't have that because our energy literacy is so low, because, you know, it's not in the interests of people who currently hold the levers of power to empower their citizens. You know, it just isn't in their interests, and therefore it does not happen. And, you know, we can change that. It is a simple thing that we can do. The fact that we aren't is, you know, as you said, a result of a whole variety of factors that relates to broader societal momentum, I guess you'd say.
I'm sure there's a dialectical argument in here, but I can't express it. But the more you hear about billions of dollars being put into renewable energy projects by the big ones, the more you think it's going to end in disaster. Do you? Or it's like encouraging us to feel okay about the present system. It's a pabulum. Is that what I mean, a pabulum? I don't know. I've never used that word
don't
before.
Know that term. I'm sorry. We can start making up words. It could be quite fun. But I think that the idea of small is beautiful is an idea that I come back to regularly when I'm thinking about this. And, you know, E.F. Schumacher's book from the 70s, you know, Economics as if People and the Planet Mattered, right? Very, very much talks about this idea that actually, you know, functionally, actually, from an evolutionary psychology perspective, we're not designed, evolved, however you want to think about it, to operate at the sort of scale that we're being asked to operate at. And actually, if we get down to smaller functional units, then there's more possibility of proper collaboration, enhanced cooperation, better societal outcomes.
All right.
It's that simple. And I mean, that's all scientific knowledge, you know, and in Europe,
Or the maximum number of community effective.
We understand that, you know, we're beholden, as I said before, to the civic religion of growth and progress in New Zealand because of our sort of neoclassical, neoliberal leanings in terms of the public dialogue, and that's very much to our detriment in the long term, unfortunately. It's just the reality of it.
It seems to me that New Zealand is a... What do you think about all that, Vim, by the way? Coming from the agro-industrial complex as you are.
Yes, that is making sure that at the moment our GDP is pretty good. But I have a couple of things to say on that matter. One, I agree with Nathan and Pip, and I think there are a couple of councils already in the Canterbury region, and I think the Canterbury Mayoral Forum is taking a leading role on this as well, that is really trying to empower the rural communities and making sure that we have a place-based economy, so that we're not going to get into.
Can you put that in practical terms?
Okay,
what does that mean?
we're making sure that there will be livelihoods in the rural space, that not everybody needs to live in a city. That's one. Secondly, I think what you see is that, and that is empowered by our local councils, by local and regional councils, and a couple of troublemakers that will ask for forgiveness later. Pip. We know each other, so that's kind of okay, I hope. The other thing is, if you look at the global market, you see at the moment our government saying, emissions, they don't matter. Then you come to the largest dairy cooperative here in New Zealand. They have customers that are investing now in our farmers to produce with less emissions. So at the moment so part of it is coming out of the cooperative. The cooperative wants to reduce CO2 emissions by 30% in 5 lactations. So that is really, really ambitious. So 5 years, a cow lactates every year.
5 lactations?
5 lactations. There you go. Yeah.
Oh, I'm going to use that all the time now.
Yeah. well, you are hosted at the moment by the only land-based specialist university in New Zealand, right?
Yeah.
So yeah. So these farmers are now being supported by our international customers to come up with something that could again change our position. So what you actually see is that we at the grassroots within that agribusiness complex, we are basically doing something slightly different than what you would think if you listen to our government, simply due to the fact that we're answering to.
So
global needs.
you reckon that the agricultural sector is doing something different simply because of consumer demand from overseas?
Yep.
And will that involve reducing the density of dairy herds, do you think?
No, I think we need to be more intensive.
More intensive?
Yes.
And how will that appease the overseas customers who know the downsides of the density?
Yeah, but more intensive, I mean, we need to make sure that we produce more efficiently. So we need to make sure that we have our... Okay, if you look at our dairy herd, and if you look at the 25% most productive dairy cows that we have here in New Zealand, those are also the ones that produce the less CO2 per kilogram milk produced. So if the whole herd would be made of the genetics of the top 25% producing dairy cows in New Zealand, we would have already reached our 2030 goal.
Okay.
So it sounds almost counterintuitive that you say, well, you need to go more intensive. I'm not saying that we need to get more cows. I'm saying
better cows.
We need to get better cows. We need to make sure that we select those cows that give us that milk with a low carbon footprint.
Right.
We need to make sure that we empower our farmers to actually cultivate their own feed. That we're not going to import any more feed, etc., etc. And with that, we can actually make that system way more carbon efficient than it currently is.
And what do you say to people who say that it's inherently inefficient to have dairy at all? I mean, the argument is that other people will produce it and they'll produce it with more global greenhouse gases, and so we may as well do it better.
Again, I don't want to go into a fundamental discussion, vegan, vegetarian, omnivores, flexitarians, because I think everybody needs to make that decision for themselves. If you look at a cow, i.e. the ruminant, that has a fermentation vessel that is so efficient to convert roughage that is grown, and well, in most places grown where not many other crops would grow. You could argue, well, that is perhaps not entirely the truth for Canterbury. But a cow is really efficient in producing that roughage. I don't know if you've seen the documentary A World Without Cows. A guy called Mark Lyons. He runs a US company, and he basically asked independent documentary makers, go out there, here's money, can we run this world without cows? It is a really interesting documentary, and basically they come up with the role of the ruminant in our society, and it basically becomes really difficult to create a world without ruminants. But again, I respect everybody's opinion here, Kim. But like there's so many layers here.
What?
Layers.
Layers, oh, layers.
And you know what we like as human beings?
I mean, that's what people say when they don't...
We want to be one-dimensional. Give me yes or no. Give me black and white. The world is not black and white.
I'm trying to find this really good quote that it's about revolution. Talk amongst yourselves for a while. I can't find it. It was something to do with whether the revolution is part of the transition or the transition is part of the revolution. And if I could only find it. It was by David Hall in the introduction to A Careful Revolution. And the question was, can transition be a revolution within capitalism, or must it be a revolution against it? And I think that's a really good question, and you know the person who's here to answer it.
I think I've just demonstrated that...
you do not believe transition can be a revolution within capitalism?
I think I've just demonstrated in my previous answer that I believe that there are parts of the transition which don't require revolution. You know, there are steps we can take incrementally, and particularly if we use something like the natural step framework or transition engineering methodology, do a proper forecasting exercise, look at 100 years into the future, beyond any reasonable expectation of fossil fuel inputs to the economy, start at that point and step backwards and figure out what the steps are to get to that desirable endpoint 100 years from now, 7 generations, you know, that sort of thing. And then
a lot of lactations.
100 lactations apparently, yeah. And start to step in that direction in a deliberate and meaningful sense. You know, that there are absolutely ways to engineer a better future. I think capitalism and industrial society and consumer society will be, I guess you'd say, casualties of moving in that direction over time, but we don't have to have violent and bloody revolution necessarily in order to get there. It's entirely possible given current trajectories, but we don't have to. And that's, again, the degrowth proposition is let's design this path to a better future. Let's engineer a soft landing.
And can we do it on our own, given that we are in a linked world?
That's a good question. I think that one of the biggest risks for New Zealand in the medium to long term is a nation that still has a level of industrial capability and military and navy, looking at New Zealand going, oh, that looks quite nice, I think I'll have that. That is a realistic possibility. You know, there are things we could do to make us less palatable in that regard, like, for example, the Swiss idea of a standing militia or things like that, you know, if we want to go in that direction, but let's not for now. Let's instead look at I think, you know, like I've said, I just don't think that we are really having conversations about the actual range of possibilities. You know, it's that whole thing of the Overton window, and part of the degrowth conversation is really about stretching that Overton window, widening the possible range of acceptable public discourse so that we can have conversations about things that are currently off the table, and we can land on a informed decision-making pathway that gives us the ability to implement that glide path and those soft landings.
You know, I always thought that was the attraction of Trump to a lot of Americans. You know, he just wanted to break things and shake them up.
Well, so
and everybody went, yeah, we want to change.
I will say this. You know, we talk a lot about change, and yet we don't want to do it. And actually, you know, sometimes, often it seems, if you take a historical perspective, it does take a Trump or a similar character to come along and start breaking things in order for us to then go, okay, well,
it's all broken.
It's all broken. So, you know, let's look at this and go, okay, realistically, we're not going to build that again, are we? Because that was built in the 150 years between the start of the Industrial Revolution and, you know, the turn of the last of the century, in a period when growth and expansion and limitless possibilities was seen as a realistic proposition. I don't think anybody really thinks that now, do they? I mean, you know, idealistically, some people still hang on to, you know, the dogmas of growth and expansion, but actually, it doesn't really ring true in this day and age, does it? You know, so it's a case of, you know, whilst we talk about one thing, we're desperately actually seeking around for an alternative, and there is an alternative there. We just need to talk about it, and, you know, until we do that, then we're not going to get very far.
All right. I want to know. I mean, I was looking at the EECA website, and they had this image of a vision of by 2050. And their vision was petrol stations will have disappeared, demand for fossil fuels halved, carbon emissions from energy used in New Zealand homes will have dropped by 75%, electricity generation is the only course of remaining residential carbon emissions. That doesn't sound terribly exciting from a revolutionary point of view, but I wanted to get your opinion, Vim, starting with you, on what, not a utopian imagination, but what do you think 2050 will look like in that context in New Zealand?
Well, I can't predict the future, otherwise I would have given you the lotto numbers for the next lottery, but I can give you my hope.
All right.
I hope it's collaborative. So I agree with Nathan there. It needs to be collaborative.
But the worse things get, the less likely we are to collaborate. You know, rats.
No, because
small spaces.
Yeah, but like I think Nathan is right. We have a common enemy, and common enemy brings people together.
If we identify the common enemy.
Sorry?
If we identify the common enemy.
Yeah, but I think as long as we take things for granted, we don't value them. So as long as we take things for granted, we don't value them. When we start valuing things, we suddenly realize that they are valuable and that we need to start protecting them. So we need to, when I arrived in this beautiful land, basically what I recognized were two parallel worlds, Maori and Pakeha. And to me it was just face value, it was just how it was, right? Because I came here as a newbie, but they just took the wrapper off me and that's it, right? But there are so many more potential polarizations between those groups that they forget that there is value in collaboration between those two. If you look at community energy, it could well be that energy is the one that will actually bring communities together, so we actually will start talking to our neighbors again. If we ask our neighbor the question, how are you? We really expect a truthful answer, rather than just saying, how are you? So my hope is in 50 years' time that energy will
Not even 50 years' time. 25 years' time.
In 25 years' time, my hope is that energy will have brought that collaborative and that community spirit into my life, into our lives.
It would be a very interesting scene, wouldn't it? Claudia, psychologically speaking. What do you think?
Well, I think two concepts. One, foot in the door, the other one, co-benefits. We talked about the revolution, and I think if things get so bad that there's no other choice, that's the sort of scenario that we don't really want to reach, right? But like the idea of this work that, when you get people to do a little thing, kind of have the foot in the door, and then it's easier for them to do more steps that are coming subsequently. So if somehow the environment was created that change can happen in a small kind of stage, and then people do it, people get used to it, and then the idea of the co-benefits also comes in how we talk about it, right? That it's not just about the sort of narrative of the change in negative terms and bad changes to the lifestyle, but there's a lot of work that shows that, just like highlighting, for instance, health benefits to a cleaner environment, right? You go out and running, and do you really want to have the diesel fuels, inhale them and, causing cancer and all sorts, or the other alternative. So it's also a lot about just what is salient to people. So kind of making the right things, the positive, the hopeful things, the benefits salient in people's minds. Sort of what the research suggests is that can be quite powerful. Again, it's not the end all be all, but I think from a psychology perspective, that's sort of where I would suggest kind of starting. And that will hopefully just help to bring things together towards better change with the right incentives and frameworks.
Thank you. Pip, what do you think?
I just keep, every time you say revolution, I keep thinking of that lyric. What is it? The revolution will not be televised. So it's kind of, our team at Orion spent a lot of time thinking about what 2050 looks like and exploring what that looks like in terms of demand. So I can give you a pretty pragmatic answer if you like.
Let's do that.
Yeah, it's kind of everything, everywhere, all at once would be my answer. So it's a combination of big utility scale generation, large scale build-up of distribution plus community and place-based energy solutions, potentially not within urban centres.
Why are you looking at both? I would have thought that one made the other unlikely or unnecessary.
The combination between the two is what's required to electrify. So you might have a balance, or it might be on a spectrum. So again, we're not predicting exactly which one it is, but there will definitely be a scale up of a utility scale. And there will definitely be some community and place-based. How big each one is depends on the level to which communities can cooperate and invest on it. And in amongst all of that, which creates a little bit of the incentive and the tipping point potentially, is how well some of those emerging markets get stood up in terms of selling how you use your energy to people like retailers or people like us. And that looks like as simple as turning your hot water on and off, or it could be as big as having a whole lot of batteries all in a big bank and turning them on and off. So and that's an emerging market. Then you've got all of the other emerging markets around co-benefits that may also make a big difference in that space.
Does anybody think that net zero emissions are achievable in New Zealand by 2050, by the way?
I think it'll be a
Oh,
challenge.
there's a resounding expression of confidence. So is it just bullshit, or is it aspirational, or is it, is there a point to that?
Yeah, it's bullshit.
What's is it knowingly?
The reality is that industrial...
I haven't asked you about your vision for 2050 yet, but...
It's okay. The reality is that that industrial activity generates emissions, that industrial activity is reliant on fossil fuels to function, and that whilst we're trying to engineer that reliance out because of the expectations of society and because of the way we've configured the systems, it's an almost impossible engineering task. There's a whole lot of delusional talk about hydrogen, about...
You haven't even talked about green hydrogen.
Nuclear and so on. These technologies may be provable at small scale. They may be, maybe in some very specific instances, almost economic with minimal subsidies. But nobody's really... Nobody who really has taken a look at them and has an engineering background and understands the technical aspect of it believes that they will scale to the level that, for example, the IPCC relies on negative emissions technologies, nets like biomass energy, carbon capture and storage. It's nonsense, and it's provable nonsense. And actually,
so, are you saying the IPCC is promoting nonsense?
Yes.
Knowingly or obliviously?
I think that what happens is you have economists bloviating about things that they aren't trained to understand, and that they unfortunately have the ear of policymakers, and because it's a good news story, people run with it.
And so...
It's just the reality, right? I mean...
And so Winston Peters is correct when he says the Paris Agreement is fortuity.
In some respects, yes. I think, there's a lot of nuance, and it's very difficult in a short format conversation like this to get to the nuance. But in a general sense, the reliance on negative emissions technologies violates the laws of thermodynamics and is fundamentally not possible hydrogen, just to take an example, is never going to be economic because it has a negative energy return once you generate the hydrogen by splitting the hydrogen and oxygen atoms apart using electrolysis.
That seems obvious. So
yeah.
why are people still banging on about it?
Because they believe economists who are telling them a good news story rather than engineers who are sat there going, hang on a second. Because people want to hear good news, and there's a genetic, evolutionary bias as to why that's the case. Actually, there is good news in the story, though, because actually, I think what we lose in terms of or what we have lost, should I say, in terms of our current overdeveloped economy, which is reliant on fossil fuels, is a whole lot of connectedness and things that in the developed nations manifests as widespread depression, anxiety, so inability to choose because we've got so many options. That's not what we're designed to live like, and actually losing some of that, which is viewed, from a particular segment of society who has a very loud microphone as, a threat to their way of thinking and their way of doing things, actually from a individual and a communal perspective will be a huge benefit to us.
I suspect that the people who are going to lose it are not the ones that are going to feel better about losing it.
No, well... Sorry, what do you mean?
Well, I mean, there's an issue of equity, whichever way you look at it.
Yeah.
But, the people who are going to suffer whatever happens are the people who are already suffering and are not in a position to be resilient about losing.
I don't know. I mean, the Musks of this world have a lot of paper wealth, but actually, when it comes to it, possession is 9/10 of the law, and, there's only so many bunkers that he can actually physically control at any given time. So, I think as the economic system unwinds and, dysfunction grows, actually a lot of that paper wealth will be eliminated. And actually, it's a case really that the higher up the cliff you climb, the further you have to fall, right?
I suspect that I'm going to be depressed when you tell me about your vision for 2050 now.
It depends. So
it does.
On the note that I've just talked about, I think that 2050, yes, we're going to try and do all the things that these guys are rightly promoting as, positive things that can increase pro-social behaviours through collaborative action on a particular topic. Energy is an obvious one because it's such an important thing to us. The reality of the fossil fuel resource depletion curves that we're on is that we will see something like a 5 to 10% per annum reduction by 2050 in the total amount of supply. And if you remember the 1970s, when by the way the economy was doing a lot better than it is now, a couple of percentage points globally nearly tanked the global economy, right? So, the reality is that we are going to see a very, very different future to the one that we think we're going to see and the one that we're being sold. And it's our choice, as I've been trying to say, to choose whether we ignore that reality, and be dragged kicking and screaming to the party, have it happen to us, or we can choose a degrowth path where we actually have adult conversations about these things, make sensible decisions based on factual evidence, and actually make that glide path a bit longer and that landing a bit softer. And that's ultimately my recommendation, and what my hope for 2050 is that we do that.
Crikey, it's the best we can hope for, isn't it? Mm-hmm. All right. Questions from you guys now. You're already shouting at him from the middle seats. I believe there are roving microphones, and so if you put your hand up, one will come to you. Yep.
Hello. This discussion has been very rational, and I appreciate that, but I'd like to ask the advice of the panellists. How do I, as an ordinary citizen, deal with those people I know who are not particularly rational, whose motivation is largely Freudian, and who, for example, insist on driving the latest double cab, gleaming 4x4 wank panzer and F you to the environment? I mean, we are not ultimately rational creatures, are we? And that's a serious question. I'd like a serious answer, please.
Yeah.
Any takers?
Sure. I mean, I think that my experience of people like that is there's a couple of things going on. So one is that that behaviour is symptomatic of deeper psychological root causes.
Crisis of masculinity.
Childhood traumas, being dropped on the head too many times as a baby. There's a whole number of things that are going on. But the reality is that you can't reason with them, as you say, and actually people like that are typically followers. So actually trying to reason with them is not necessarily a good idea. Trying to support the sorts of initiatives that we're talking about here and get to that critical mass of people who are following that path, and when people can see it's a better path, then they'll just go, oh, of course, that's what I was going to do all the time, And at which point you go, that's brilliant, you go for it, because ultimately, there's ego involved and a whole lot of trauma driving that ego, and maybe we can unpick that, but maybe we can't, and that's a whole different conversation for another day.
And may I give a really practical answer?
Short of slashing his tires.
Really? No. We got an electric tractor. And the first electric tractor that I saw was from that gentleman that is sitting just in front of you. And so we got an electric tractor here. And we demonstrated it at the Innovation Expo in Tapai in Christchurch. And this person walks up to me and said, "This is no good. This is no good. What do you do when the battery runs out?" You know what my answer was? What do you do when your diesel tank is empty? You refuel. So it's all about us changing, and sometimes disasters need to happen before people change. I'll leave it at that.
Who was the next hand up? Go.
It's kind of a question for Nathan, but for everybody.
Is the mic on?
So the mic's on.
Let's go to somebody who has a live mic.
Thank you for having a live mic. My question is about AI. So, like, clearly we know that we're on the cusp of another kind of a revolution, and on the one hand, I think AI can be used to really address a lot of these issues, but it also is an enormous consumer of energy. And so how do we factor that sort of unknowable in some sense, but into these conversations so that we can include it without using up all the energy just for data centers?
Yeah, good question. Like Bitcoin, the amount of energy required to use Bitcoin is just astonishingly huge. I don't know whether anybody's got the expertise to talk about that yet.
We run pretty regular.
That doesn't work.
What?
AI is snake oil.
Yes, all right. We'll come to that. Sorry, Pep, you were saying.
Just that's something that we look at in the process of trying to forecast what energy demand will possibly look like through to 2050. So
And
we
you
haven't
factor
landed.
all that in.
We have to think about those sorts of things. And
I mean, this will be why, you know, the lower estimate is that we'll need 3 times as much energy by 2050 as we are using now. Because there'll be heaps of stuff that's going to chew it up.
yes.
But then it would be so good to put a horticulture site next to my data center, because that data center needs to be cooled with water. At the moment we do the smart thing, but just dump the water in the environment. It's called waste. So we don't actually value that waste. If we take that waste, if we take that thermal heat that is in that water and pump it through a greenhouse, or put a retirement home or a hospital or something next to it that requires that heat, at that moment in time we're looking at our system holistically, and we're actually valuing the waste that we're creating. And at that moment in time, I still agree that data centers require a lot of electricity. But if they can make our system more resilient, efficient, whatever you want to use, and we are using our waste streams, then I think that the effect is mitigated.
I mean, it calls for a level of connectedness, doesn't it? That I can see being wrought on the local level, but I can't see it on the national level. Does that matter?
When Minister Parker, when he was still minister, announced that he was really happy to have data centers in Auckland, I actually wrote to him and said, well, where's the announcement about what you're going to do with the waste water, with the hot water? Never got an answer. So but we can change these things. We can do these things. At the moment, the biogas facility that I talked to you about in Reparua, what's happening there? Turners and Growers has a greenhouse next to it. So we have the organic waste from Auckland City Council and from a lot of industries being turned into methane gas. We capture the CO2 and we pump the heat and the CO2 in the greenhouse, and we have these beautiful capsicums and tomatoes that we grow.
Right.
So we need to look at these things holistically.
Where was the other hand up I saw? Microphone there, yes?
My question's really for Nathan. You talk about degrowth.
Yes.
You're actually in Selwyn, the fastest growing place in the country.
Yeah.
What does degrowth look like for Selwyn, for Christchurch, for Canterbury?
That's an excellent question. I mean, the reality is that as climate weirding and industrial dysfunction grows, we will see a lot more relocation of people. I think, you know, there's a great report from the Post-Carbon Institute called The Future is Rural. So we'll see a lot of people moving back into rural areas, away from the urban centres, as those urban centres, which are built on a presumption and a requirement for continuous large-scale flows of energy, start to fail. And the question of what degrowth looks like in a growing place relates, in my view, to looking at it in terms of per capita energy consumption that you're building into new housing stock, the infrastructure, etc., and making sure that you're solving not just for capital efficiency, but also ecological outcomes, societal outcomes, etc. So there's a multi-criteria analysis that needs to be done, and that can include a measure around the energy intensity of use, which allows you to actually plan for a degrowth within a growing place. Degrowth is a term that's more of a mentality than a physical fact. Just because something's growing doesn't mean it can't be degrowth compatible.
Can I just, sorry, I know there's a microphone out there, hands up. On an individual level, Nathan, how does one plan for the kind of future that you say is likely?
Okay, can I talk about my own individual level planning?
Yeah.
Deep pantry, big veggie garden. I built a SIPS panel house that's a very low consumption energy consumption house, which has multiple layers that I've engineered within it in terms of energy systems. So, for example, we're completely off-grid. We've got nickel-ion batteries, which is an old battery technology, sometimes known as Edison batteries, where you can use wood lye to make the electrolyte for them. There's examples of those batteries that have been running for 100 years, and they'll probably outlast the solar panels and the rest of the system. One of the big benefits of those batteries is that they're relatively inefficient on a round-trip basis, about 65% compared to 95% for lithium-ion. But you can take solar panels configured to, say, 80 volts and have a contactor and just put that directly into the batteries. You don't need all the fancy electronics and so on. So there's really, my system can degrade over time as, say, an inverter fails and is no longer available in the market. So there's things like that, and this comes from, thinking that's rooted in, transition engineering and that sort of thinking right into the future and coming back. Water systems where, we collect water off the roof and we've got rainwater collection. Obviously, that's somewhat challenging in an urban environment. But again, in Selwyn District, if anybody is not collecting water off their roof and they're building a new house, it should be mandatory. It's not rocket science, so appropriate technology, simple systems that can degrade gracefully over time. Those are all things we can engineer into our built environment.
Thank you for that. Where was the microphone?
It's working. Is this working?
No.
Yeah, just yell. I'll repeat the question. Just yell.
Okay, I'll try. At the Downstream Energy Conference last week, all the keynote speakers talked enthusiastically about growth as a strategy, as an agenda. How do you manage the dissonance between that and climate change? Do we need an energy strategy in this country?
Yes.
Yes. So the question was the Downstream Energy Conference, everyone's talking about growth and do we need an energy strategy? I think clearly we need an energy strategy. I think the energy strategies that we have are often very limited. The New Zealand Business Energy Council's scenario planning, which drives a lot of thinking in industry around energy futures, has to include scenarios around things like zero import of fossil fuels as a scenario for the future, and that will drive different thinking. So, but in terms of the current thinking that's out there in central policy circles and so on, the energy strategies coming out of there around efficiency and lots of underlying assumptions which are tacit, they're not explicitly stated, around things like business as usual and no major perturbations to the system and the ability to recover entirely to somewhere near where we were post, say, Alpine fault quake or something of that nature, or in economic collapse. A lot of these different disasters, a lot of the risks that we have all point to the same solutions, which are small, local, appropriate technology, things that were done in the 70s. Like, I was speaking to a guy at an energy meeting down in Southland about 10 years ago, and he ran his tractor on syngas from a wood gas producer for 10 years in the 1970s. These things are totally possible, and retrofit of that sort of technology is something that we can, and ultimately I think we'll end up doing. I've got a great big squirrel file of all this sort of stuff that I'm just waiting for someone to come and ask me about, or see an opportunity to talk to people about these sorts of things, because ultimately we are going to have to do with less, and we're going to have to simplify, and that doesn't mean that we can't have sophisticated solutions. Just look at some of the stuff that was produced in the early parts of the Industrial Revolution. Really sophisticated, long living. I've got tools in my garage that are probably 100 years old. We need to design for durability and that sort of thing as well.
But I agree. We we need to have an energy plan, but nationally. But sometimes we can't control national, but we can control local.
Yeah.
So what we did is we asked Selwyn District to actually create one. And
An energy strategy.
Yes, and they listened. And so we're actually going to develop that together with them. And so more to come.
See, that sounds exciting to me.
The cool thing there is that then the Canterbury Mayoral Forum heard of this and said, we need to know where we stand. So the Canterbury Mayoral Forum is doing an energy stocktake. So again, that will be the basis for an energy plan. So it's not that we are sitting in a vacuum and thinking that, whoa, the worst things can happen, or listen to these large people saying, well, it will be a large-scale utility. No, there is definitely a movement in Selwyn District, but also in Canterbury, of councils and EDBs, and in that case, universities as well, both from Canterbury University, Lincoln University, that are really supporting this local energy transition. So we don't have the solutions, we don't have the answers, but yes, we are taking it seriously, and we will come up with a plan.
I don't know how much. What time would you finish? Who? 9:15. Oh, 25. All right, time for more questions. Who's got the microphone? Speak up, whoever it is.
I've got the microphone. Am I live? Good. There are two types of energy that I haven't heard you talk about much here tonight. One is nuclear, which in this country you have a history of not, I'm from Canada, so in this country you have a history of not wanting anything nuclear, and I understand that. But the other one that you have the potential for a huge abundance of is geothermal. And geothermal doesn't have to be a Rotorua. You can heat your house with geothermal energy simply by drilling some pipes down into the ground, circulating water at, in the winter, you pump water down that's cold, let's say 2 degrees, if it was that cold.
Do you want to know why we're not using more geothermal energy on a local level?
Well, in local levels. Anyway, you can do it in your backyard. Yes, it's expensive now, but if everybody was doing it, it would be cheap. So that, to me, and if you've got a ready supply of places like Rotorua, why can't we do that more in New Zealand?
Anybody know the answer?
We have ground source heat pumps at Newland University.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I can't hear what you said, madam.
And new buildings have got ground source heat pumps.
All right. Why isn't it more ubiquitous throughout New Zealand? Is it possible that it could be? Do you know, Pip?
Well,
Yeah.
Gas was cheap.
Let's ask the panel, shall we?
I think Lincoln University, we had the earthquakes, and unfortunately a large part of our campus was destroyed. But it also gave us the opportunity to build new. And we didn't build new directly after the earthquakes. It took a little bit of time before money from government insurance came towards us. A lot of people would have felt it was mean that they didn't give us the money directly. On hindsight, it was probably a good thing, simply due to the fact that we now could build something that is future-proof. If you look at the building that we built, the Waimarie building, completely state-of-the-art, and because we could build with a blank canvas, we could actually integrate ground source heat pumps. It is fully integrated with solar panels, etc., etc. So we could rotate the building, isolate the building, use the building materials that we did. We had that opportunity because we could build a new asset. It becomes a little bit more complicated if you need to retrofit older assets. Yeah, I think that's why we don't do it more often, because it's just a little bit more difficult. Nathan, perhaps?
Can I say something on that? So context, I was involved in a project called One New Change in central London. It's the largest ground source heat pump installation in Europe at the time, in 2008-9. 220 energy piles with pipes clipped to the rebar in the ground, and a 1.5 megawatts ground source heat pump installation. The reality of those systems is that you get an incremental improvement in what's known as seasonal energy efficiency ratio, SEER, over a air source heat pump, but it's not enough to drive the economics of it without regulatory pressure. And so the reality of ground source heat pumps, to take that specific example, is the benefit that you get from it compared to the cost of moving the earth, drilling a hole, grouting the pipes in, all those sorts of things, unless you're doing them anyway, like in the case of energy piles and so on a new build, it affects the economics. So that's one of the big reasons we haven't seen a wider rollout of that sort of active ground-coupled heat pump system. I agree, things like earth ducts are a very elegant solution. When I was trenching between my house and the container that I've got my PV array on, I put a couple of pieces of pipe in the ground so that I could, it's about 800-900 mils down, so that I could take cool air in and using a low energy, 100-watt fan or something, drag that slowly through into the house and cool the house in the sorts of climate events that I see coming up in the future. I haven't actually connected it up yet because, as it happens, because the house is so well built in terms of the thermal performance, I haven't really needed it yet. I do believe those sorts of simpler arrangements are very, very doable, and the sorts of things that we should be doing. Again, appropriate technology, low tech, it really wins in my view, and particularly from a maintainability in the long term perspective.
Thank you. Yes. Oh!
Sorry. I was just wondering, what strategies do you think that we should be using to demand these systematic changes that you've all been talking about? Like, should we be sitting on roads? Should we be unionizing and going on strike, or like killing CEOs of major healthcare companies?
Sorry, somebody else want to go first?
Are you directing that at anybody in particular?
I guess anyone, but maybe Nathan and Claudia predominantly.
All right. Claudia, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I can start. I mean, I think that being visible with the opinion is definitely generally good in terms of then building a necessary crowd, right? Like if we all just sit at home and we sort of think our own thoughts, but no one else knows, then that sort of momentum, that like movement character cannot come, right? So the sort of social movements that we have seen where like people come together, it's like a common goal, and that can sort of maybe like create pressure that can be beneficial. However, there's of course also sometimes the cost of then, putting others off, like, for instance, like back in the days with like Extinction Rebellion, like London, when they then interrupted public transport, right? Like that has cost to people who actually like need it, and they needed to get to work, and like then this can clash in terms of how then society, goes into like camps sort of like for and against again. But in terms of, being very vocal and finding those groups also in terms of support, like when it comes to like climate anxiety and all of these issues, sort of like finding a group and having that togetherness, psychologically speaking, is definitely a good thing. And, something has to happen. So maybe not the kind of like cutting everything down revolution, but the sort of building momentum in a group.
There's something, I mean, if we are facing a crisis, I feel a bit weird about, the message not to offend anybody in the protest, not épater les bourgeoisie. I mean, if something needs to be done or said, then...
Yes, no, I was just talking more about that it will then possibly have some repercussions, right? And then like, politicians or whoever can then take this and like say, well, this is the upside, but like this is a downside as well. So it's just more about being aware of like who would be alienated and if that is okay or if that is not okay. So it was just more about strategic.
I mean, this is not an incitement to violence in any way.
Yeah.
But the guy that killed the healthcare company CEO, right? He gathered a huge crowd of people supporting him and voicing discontent, rightful and righteous discontent, about the way the health system in America is run. So arguably, Nathan, did you want to say something?
I feel like that's a bit of a trap at this point.
No.
No, I think it's a both-and situation. I think that, everyone has a part to play. I think that ultimately we can't sustain things that we're not gifted and passionate about. And if that's what you're gifted and passionate about is, directly getting in someone's face and shouting at them, then by all means do that. At the same time, if you're gifted and passionate about energy transition and the subtleties of, ground source heat pump, seasonal energy efficiency performance and so on, then do that, there's a place for everyone. And I think, we all collectively doing our bit can shift this momentum, And it's in a sense, it's good that we've got momentum, right? We can't steer a parked car, right? So, it's just a question of directing that energy somewhere. And we all have a part to play in that.
Was there another question? Yeah, have you got the microphone?
No, but I can yell.
Okay.
So my question is degrowth, and I guess all of you have the capacity to answer this in some way. From what I'm understanding from degrowth is it could look a little bit, the landing pad eventually, for generations to come, will look a bit more like the Amish or the Solomon Islands or something like that, because ultimately you're talking about play space, so we're not going to be having quite the same international trade that we have now, so it would be really going back to older ways of living.
You mean we'll be stuck here and nobody will visit us?
We won't be outsourcing things from China, is probably more it.
Yeah.
Potentially. That could be what it might look like into generations, right?
Potentially.
So, given that, what have you guys learnt from what you were talking about before, Pip and Wim, about what you've done locally with the energy and the community, and what you've learnt, Nathan, by being off-grid living, and maybe what Claudia's picked up in her studies? What can we start to implement now that we're able to do, and whether it's people doing, this lady talked about what she can do, come and do your submissions. Central and local government are always asking people to do submissions. So what can we start implementing so that local government, central government, and people can make choices now that we can do? Because I like what you've said, Nathan. You've given us solutions by talking about off-grid living, and I think there's a lot of opportunity. Rainwater collection was mentioned. Let's build on that.
I'm not going to start. Come on, you guys.
Just do it and ask for forgiveness later.
Yeah.
What way? Do what?
Well, you know what I'm doing for the council, right? And that is just, I walked up to the chief exec of Selwyn District Council together with Sam Elder from Orion. And we walked up to her and said, do we have a deal for you? And what I like about Sharon, Sharon is the chief executive of Selwyn District Council, is that she truly believes in partnerships. And she took the time to hear us out. And we came with a collaborative approach. Then you guys wrote it into strategy. You voted for that as well. And the cool thing is, when it's in strategy, we need to do something with that. And that's what we're going to do. So sometimes it is just a couple of people, and very much like perhaps I use different words than you would use, but just stepping up to somebody and say, hey, listen, do I have a deal for you? And then just take it as it comes. And failure could be one of them. But if I don't try, I'll never know.
We have time for one more question, if it's a really, really good one.
Well, Well, I've no idea whether it's a good one or not, but it seems to me that some of the lessons we could have learned have come out through health and safety. I mean, we brought on seat belts, we've got helmets for the cyclists, and that's done through policy, technology and communication. In terms of getting the energy message out, perhaps we can learn from that. And I was also thinking about during the first lockdown, when we had that marvellous cohesion throughout all of society. I mean, I had neighbours talking to me who never talked to me before, albeit across the road. And we had the teddy bears, and we had the tag team of Jacinda and her cohort. We had the banners about kindness. And so at that time, we had a cohesive New Zealand.
Somebody mentioned before the need for a common enemy in order to bring us together.
Well, that was a pandemic. We obviously don't want that again. But I'm just wondering if we can learn from some of those things in the past.
Can I answer that?
Yes.
Yeah, so we absolutely can. I mentioned a couple of times tonight the transition methodology, and actually the reality is that that's a methodology pioneered right here in Christchurch by Susan Crumdyke and the Advanced Energy Materials Lab. She's now currently over in Ateri at Watt, but the methodology that she proposes, the transition engineering labs, are a way of actually bringing effectively, the same sort of thinking as that health and safety driver to this problem of what our energy system should look like. And, for those elected members in the room, commissioning someone to run some sort of transition engineering labs in this community or in the region, it will be a highly recommended approach. There's a lot that, I hope I've said that's somewhat counterintuitive in some respects. It certainly goes against some of the common narratives, and that methodology helps us to make some of that explicit and to just kind of sit with it for a bit and have some adult conversations. So, yeah.
All right. Thank you. And please thank the panel, them and Claudia and Nathan.